We're going to cover two topics today. One should be pretty quick, but could be useful on other projects. I wanted to point it out. If you're doing a Dewdrop project and you're using Silex to manage a lot of the application inside of the admin, it's very easy to say, for this admin component, I want to just adjust the permissions so that this user group can see it, this user group can't, this user group can create new items in it, this one can't, all that stuff. On a WordPress project, sometimes that can work as long as you're okay with the user seeing the WP admin interface, which sometimes you're not. You don't want them to be logged in and seeing posts and media and pages and all this other stuff, or even just being made aware of the fact that this is a WordPress site. But you don't want to necessarily duplicate your coding effort on the admin side and the front end. So this came up in particular on the Communicate on Demand project that we're doing with Mizzou Advantage right now, where there are certain admin components that we want normal users to be able to access. So they have a login, but we really don't want them seeing WP admin. We want them to be in the site's theme. The front end should look like the theme, not like WP admin. So I talked with Ray about this a little bit, and it's not terribly difficult to make this happen in Dewdrop. The ability to have all of the admin stuff be kind of URL agnostic or not really care what the URL structure is already in there, obviously, because we have Silex and WordPress. So when I go to this page, you can see that my page is CRUD for my wonderful admin component of cruddy things. And the page or the route is edit, and it's translating that to point to the right piece of the code in your Dewdrop project. We're just going to do the same thing on the front end, but obviously it's not page and route necessarily because we're not in WP admin anymore. It's just our own thing. So in this case, I don't even have mod rewrite set up on this little WordPress install I have locally. So I've got page ID equals 4 and underscore component equals CRUD. And then if I go to click add and underscore page equals edit. So I'm just using two query string parameters to point to the right piece of the code in Dewdrop instead of using in Silex what would be, the route itself, or in the WordPress admin, I'm using their hooks to do it, the add action and all that stuff. So from a code perspective, this really all takes place in two classes. First, we'll look here. This is where I'm kicking it off. I'm saying I'm going to initialize this admin shortcode class, which is right here. The only tricky part to this is that you need to know what URL is the shortcode going to be used on. So you need to set that to whatever page you're going to add your admin shortcode to. Because we need to be able to detect before the shortcode would naturally be able to detect in the lifecycle of a WordPress request. So that's what's happening here. I'm saying if my base URL is at the beginning of my request URI, then I'm going to start running this code. I'm going to start up my shortcode admin environment, which I'll show in a second. And then I'm going to add my shortcode. And when the shortcode is dispatched, all it really has to do is output a little bit of wrapping HTML that I'm using and the output from the admin environment. The reason I have to do it this way is the admin environment is going to queue up some resources, some JavaScript and CSS. And by the time I would be inside the shortcode and the dispatch method there, I would be too late in the game to do that. WP head would already be rendered. Can't really add more CSS at that point in a good way. So that's why I'm just detecting the URL myself instead of relying on the shortcode to detect it, getting all of my output generated, and then I let the shortcode come in and insert that into the page. Now, the admin environment itself is how you tie Dewdrop admin components into any environment that you want. So this could be in Framework 1, Silex, WordPress, or in this case, the WordPress front end. But it would be trivial to do this in Laravel or whatever. It's a very small amount of code. So in this case, the main things we're doing are in the layout rendering portion, we're queuing up resources. So this is pretty much like it is on the admin. There's a couple little things that we're skipping when we're not in the admin. Yay, globals in WordPress. Then we give it a URL assembling method. So we say, okay, for this component and this page and this set of parameters, what does the URL look like in this environment? In our case, it's that underscore component and underscore page variables. Those are the things we look at. Initializing the component, we're telling it, hey, this is your environment. It's a shortcode environment on the front end of WordPress. And we're registering a hook so that you can access your pages over Ajax in addition to rendering HTML into the theme. So we have that one WordPress hook still there. We don't even care about this anymore. Determining if our component is active is, again, just looking at that query string underscore component. If that equals my component slug, the component is active. And then finally, to dispatch it, you're just looping over components, finding the active one, and starting the page dispatch cycle. So most of that logic lives inside the component itself, and these two methods create page object and dispatch page. This is where page gets defaulted to index right here. Pretty straightforward. And then we store the output so that once the shortcode actually runs and we're in the right context to spit the output into the theme, we have it available in the get output method, which is what you see back in the shortcode itself here. So say, okay, now I'm ready for the shortcode. Give me the output that you generated before, and then we put that out into the theme. So you end up with your admin code running on the WordPress front end. So like I said, nothing terribly complicated, but it shows how the admin environment stuff actually plugs in. Obviously, on some level, you're really just talking like, okay, I've got this big box here that I'm rendering into, and the Chrome of it doesn't matter all that much. There are little environment-specific bits, but all of that is isolated into the env classes. You don't have to scatter that throughout Dewdrop core or anything like that when you're doing a new admin environment. So that was topic number 1. If there are no questions on that, I'll move into the bigger topic.
Can you go to that in an incognito window?
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Just make sure you don't have to be logged in.
So yeah, same thing.
Cool.
And if you wanted to do authentication of some kind, you would just throw that before the rendering. So if you wanted to say, I already closed it. If you wanted to say before rendering that admin stuff, hey, check if WP current user has a certain subscriber level or whatever, you could do that before even getting into the admin, and that would just use WordPress auth. So that part stays the same.
Admin stuff, not even authentication and all that, is that basically just ignored in a WordPress environment?
Yeah, when it comes to authentication, we use WordPress completely. The only case where you're going to interact with Dewdrop authentication APIs when you're in WordPress is if you're setting the permissions on something. That still works normally. So I believe Darby may have turned some permissions on and off on Glowforge and things like that. I'm not completely remembering the details, but yeah, logging in, password resets, that's all just WordPress when you're doing a WordPress plugin. Cool. Okay, longer topic. I think this could end up being a pretty cool feature for us to promote on our projects if we get this right. So I wanted to get some early feedback on it. I'm going to be working on it more in the coming weeks to really try to flesh it out a lot. But essentially, when we got the mock-ups on Pronto Spot, we had our early discussions on the project. One of the things that came up was logging like this. So not just a text string, although obviously this could just be a plain HTML string, but linking to the entities that are involved in a login message. So I actually know this is user ID whatever, and this log message is the idea. This is something that's come up a lot in the past where we've tried to shoehorn user login or a display of activity to an end user into Delta log or something like that. And it works on some level, but also it's kind of clunky just because you have one audience in mind when you're writing to something like delta log or monologue, and you have a different audience in mind when you're trying to display something more akin to like a news feed or recent activity feed on Facebook. Like you want it to be more user friendly and it's a higher level thing. So I don't necessarily want to know when every database row is saved. That's overkill. I want to know when a high level action in my application takes place. And I want it to be displayed in a user friendly way. So looking at that UI, the way that we came up with to support it is writing the messages out like this. So I say, insertion order ID equals 20069, and then whatever text I want. So using shortcodes from, WordPress or BB Edit or wherever you want to trace that lineage to. Getting this structure allows us to then store these relationships. So if I look in the entities table here, let's just take one example so it's easier to read. So I've got my log message 5 relates to the insertion order 20069, and this was the title text that was rendered when it was put into the log, right? With this, I would be able to pretty easily write a query to say, hey, give me every log message related to insertion order 20069. So I can see every place where this entity was touched in the system very easily. I think this concept is pretty cool in the sense that we can enable some neat features with it. One that I really want to work on is giving the end user a UI where they can select an entity of some kind or a group. So I could say, like, I want to know anytime there's a log message related to this user, send me an email, that kind of thing. I think that could be a big deal. The other aspect of this that I think can be really interesting for us before we get into the implementation is that actually I don't have it right there. We store, in addition to the message, I'm storing what right now I'm calling a summary, and I might change that wording. But the summary is essentially a 1 to 2 word action of what happened. So if you're looking at these log messages, download, update, email, upload, those are the actions or the summaries in the lingo that I'm using right now. My thought is that if we can then break down the log messages by the action that was taken or the summary, we can get some basic stats. So I could say how many files were downloaded this month versus last month, or how many times were insertion orders updated in the system today, that kind of thing. So we can get very basic stats rendered out on a time series. It's kind of my thought as a big end user feature here. So to sum up where I'm going with this, we're trying to get to the point that I can show a log for an entity in a system. What has happened with Nicolas Cage and PronoSpot over the last week? I want to be able to display that in a dashboard kind of view like this, and its own admin component in a view page for an entity. So if I want to go to an activity log on a particular company in a system, I want that to be very easy to do. And then I want to be able to subscribe to particular things based on those searches and display stats. So that's kind of the overall use case we're trying to tackle here. Now, implementation-wise, what does this actually look like? What are you going to have to do in your app to pull it off? Let's start going down that rabbit hole a little bit. So we've got these messages. The thing that jumps out at you, obviously, is how do I know what an insertion order shortcode is? Where does that get translated? What do I have to add to my system to make that work? A couple different aspects to that. One, I'm adding an activity log folder that Dewdrop is aware of. I don't think I'm going to put it in the project skeleton by default, because I think in most cases you're not going to need this. So that's one aspect of it. the reason you're not going to need it in most cases is your Dewdrop DB table subclasses now provide an activity log handler by default. So what is an activity log handler? In essence, it is an implementer of this interface. There might be a couple more methods on this by the time I'm done, but this is the essential idea. Give me a log so that I can write and or log something that's just an alias. Write and log are the same thing. I need to be able to get a name for the handler. Insertion order would be the name in this case. Fully qualified name, that's how we store it in the database. You saw that on the entity table. Let me pull one of those up. This is a fully qualified name for a handler. It's a concept that's similar to the fully qualified name on an admin component that we saw when you're storing like sorted fields and things like that in the database. We use that concept. Aliases, this is, everyone keeps typing insertion orders instead of insertion order or whatever it might be. Add an alias, keep it simple. The ability to have an icon associated with the handler. This, very much like the icon on an admin component, is arbitrary. It depends on what the renderer is going to be. In the case of rendering icons on components and Pronospot, it's CSS classes. In WordPress, I think it's an image of some kind. You say it's like context.ping. So it depends on the renderer, but it's some string that's going to then be rendered into a CSS class or a source attribute on an image, whatever it might be. And then render title text. So if I give you a 5 and you're the insertion orders activity log handler, what are you going to give me as the title for that? What is the text? So again, looking at our UI example here, Nicolas Cage would be for a user, insertion order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for an insertion order. This is a hook to allow your handler to adjust how it does that. I've got kind of our standard logic in place to try to do that by default. So it'll look for title, name, first name and last name. It'll combine those if you have them. Username, or if none of that is available, it'll default to doing the singular title of your model plus number and the primary key. So you get something by default. So that is the public interface that we care about. Now, there are several layers above this that are available in the Dewdrop API for this. So we just looked at the handler interface, what we actually use to talk to activity log handlers. There's above that an abstract handler that implements some of these things in a very basic way for you. So you can extend directly from this, throw something in your activity log folder, and go from there. Then there is a CRUD handler on top of that. And we'll talk about how this integrates with admin CRUD in just a little bit here, because it takes care of most of your common uses automatically. And then on top of that, there's the table handler. And this is the one that I think most people will actually usually be interacting with, because this comes straight from your models automatically. And essentially, this is just setting some defaults on top of that CRUD handler. So if I know that I'm starting with a database table, I can set the name for you by inflecting it from the table name. So it's a singular hyphenized version of the table name. I also added an alias for the table name itself, just in case people fall back on using that. And then I provided the ability to override the title logic in a simple way so that you can do that directly in your model class. My thought on doing the table handler in this way and embedding it in the Dewdrop DB table class itself is I'm trying to avoid you having to add a whole nother set of files to your project. So you've already got this huge list of models, and then you've probably got a list of admin components that is somewhat similar. It's usually a subset of your models. I didn't want to have the same list in the activity log folder. So doing it this way, it's more like you're going to be adding a few lines to your init method in your table at the most, instead of doing a whole new class. So that's how you get your handlers. Now, what does a handler actually do? In a lot of ways, it's just a way to get to the log. So you can just write to it directly. You saw that on the interface. I can just call write or call log and pass it a summary and a message, and that's it. I don't have to do anything more than that. My thought, though, is that the handler is also a place where you could hang additional methods, and you saw that on the CRUD handler abstract is what I was looking for. So I've got these methods on my handler for common actions. So I'm saying, for example, if you want to log an import message on this handler, I want you to give me a count of the records that were imported and the file name that was used to import them. So instead of you just writing that log message wherever you're going to be logging this action, I've got this method on my handler so I can kind of centralize that presentation. I can centralize how I'm going to do that login. That's one aspect of it, is centralizing the messages so that they don't become inconsistent. You're just sprinkling text strings throughout your entire project. The other aspect is, typically this is all I want to do when I'm logging an edit on a CRUD component. I just want to grab my CRUD message template for editing and throw it in the log. I could very well want to do something more complicated than this. Like I could see getting something similar to this as my API at some point. And then if old data is different than new data in some way, I'm going to add an additional log message that maybe says so-and-so approved the media file. So I'm going to take the fact that an edit happened, and I'm going to add more log messaging and more specific log messaging based upon that. And I don't want to have to, again, go back into every spot in the code where it's happening. I just want to centralize that in my handler. So that's what the handlers look like. Actually using them for a lot of use cases is just going to be automatic. And here's how that works. When you use the CRUD components that are built into Dewdrop, which I know people use pretty heavily, I just say, if you're trying to get an activity log handler for this component, ask its primary model first. So if I haven't set one already, go ahead and look for one on the primary model. So we already have that kind of anchor point where we say, this is the key model on this component. This is where its primary key rests, all of that stuff. So let's just get the log handler from that. Once we have that, the stock pages can take care of actually doing the interaction. So if I look at the delete stock page, for example, this is the key bit here. I'm getting the handler from the component and I'm logging delete on it. One thing, minor implementation detail kind of, but you'll notice this null handler concept. There's a handler that doesn't do anything. It's just a dummy handler, and that's assigned to your component by default. And that way you can still call the log methods all you want. If you're writing Dewdrop core code, you can just keep logging stuff and it'll just go into a black hole until someone sets a handler that actually does stuff. So you don't have to put conditionals around all your logging and things like that. So that's why that's there. So yeah, this is what your handler looks like. Now, if you were doing something where you kind of know, I'm only ever going to log this in one place. I don't want to do this additional method on my handler and set up a class and all this stuff. You could just call log and whatever it might be, insertion order ID equals 5 is now deleted. So you can just write that directly. In fact, if you're doing that, you don't even really have to go through the handler itself. You could just do Dewdrop pimple, get resource, activity log, and call log or write on that. Those same two methods are there. So deleted and then whatever. So all of those are essentially equivalent in this particular case. The handler, as far as the basic CRUD stuff goes, that is obviously it's embedded in Dewdrop core. It's in the admin stock pages. If you do need to customize those messages in some way, you could either modify your handler, so you do a subclass of the handler and change what the delete method does. Or if you wanted to globally in your application change what these strings are. So, by default, it might say like user updated, whatever the entity might be, insertion order number 5. And you wanted to change that instead of updated, edited, or something like that. There is a resource available, CRUD message templates, where all of those are built in. So you can override that at bootstrap time. All of the core stuff that goes into Pimple is here. So you can see you have your activity log resource available in Pimple if you ever need to just get at that and write messages as simply as possible. And then, like I said, you've also got your CRUD message templates are built in there, and that's how we pull those in, those default strings. So you would be able to define your own resource and call set template on it to modify these messages if you wanted to do that. Once you have all of that stuff in place, you're writing messages to the log. We use a new dependency that I wanted to point out briefly. It's a shortcode parser that's really nicely put together. It has parsers for several different standards of shortcode. Even has one that embeds all of the WordPress quirks if you wanted to go down that terrible path to hell. But in general, it just looks like this. So you grab this facade API that they have, you say for the hello shortcode, this is how I want to replace the content of it. I want to process on this text, and you just call facade process, and it's going to return the text with the replacements made. So very simple API, and you can also just use the parser, which is what I was going to show now. So if I go into the main activity log object, I've got a shortcode parser here, which is coming out of that dependency. So Thunder shortcode parser, regular parser. And if I pass some text to it, it's just going to give me a bunch of shortcode objects where I can get the parameters and the name of the shortcode. So in this case here, I am looping over the shortcodes. And first I say, hey, you have to have an ID on them. It's kind of one of the rules in the way that we're doing these logs. And then we look and see, do we have a handler that matches the name of the shortcode? And that could be its name or its alias. Name takes precedence over the aliases. So if it matches the name, you're always going to get that one. Then give me the ID and use that to have the handler render that title text for us. So change the shortcode into the actual title text that we're going to use and store in the database. So then we gather up all the entities from those shortcodes and we pass that on to our database gateway to save them. The next step that I have is doing the reverse. So, okay, I've got a whole bunch of log messages and now I need to make little HTML links out of them. That should be relatively straightforward, and there's going to be some stuff built into Dewdrop to do it for you. So if you have a CRUD component, you're automatically going to get an activity log page on that component that will show all of this stuff and let you filter and hopefully show those stats and things like that too. One other aspect of this that's worth noting is we're planning on making it so the way that the links for an entity behave is a little bit more complex. So there are a couple of aspects to that. One is you can't just say set link on a handler. You need to be able to do like set link by security type on a handler, kind of like you can for a field and a field object. So set the link or set it for these 3 security levels, because other people can't get to that area in the admin, or other people are going to go to an equivalent link on the public side of the site. They're not going to go to the admin page, that kind of thing. In addition to that, we're looking at doing little flyovers or pop-ups on these links. That could be something as simple as, render the view page in a modal, like we do on the standard Dewdrop Bootstrap admin right now. And it could get a little bit more complex than that, in the sense of like being able to add an action to a handler and then have those actions represented as buttons or something like that. One thing that could be very nice in that regard is this is going to kind of accidentally get us at least some UI that people could use to restore something that's been deleted. Because we can say in the log, Nicolas Cage deleted morning.mp3, and let him click on that to restore it. So that's something I want to add, as at least having some kind of stopgap UI to let people restore things that are marked as deleted, because right now we don't have that and we have to do it ourselves, which sucks. So I think that pretty much covers everything. Any thoughts on that? Things that you think we should explore with it?
I have a couple questions on anonymous actions.
Okay.
I didn't see anything that was baked in there for like we have some pages that are anonymously hit, just like a Google Doc that has the crazy URLs and don't require user access, but we want to log that came in from a non-user. So basically, unknown user for IP address 4.4.4.4 did something specific. I see all your user messages are all very, user there. How would that get handled, I guess?
So yeah, if it was anonymous CRUD being done, the CRUD message templates here does have a set that are intended to be used in that anonymous context as well. And it detects which one it should use. It says, if I don't have a user, use the anonymous version. If I do have a user, use that. But again, this is just handling the stock normal CRUD stuff. So let's look in particular at something in Chronospot. So if I'm looking at our traffic instructions page, this is the actual code. The first thing here, you could do, I'm going to do this in the quickest, dirtiest way possible. Get resource. Whatever. So if they had a key that was wrong, and I wanted to log the fact that someone tried to go to this page and they didn't have the right key for the traffic instructions, this would do it. This would get you into the activity log.
Okay, I didn't see I saw when you pulled the table up, I saw a user, I saw a date created, but I didn't see like an IP address. So how would we know, somebody's trying to beat on us from some IP address in Ukraine or something? Is that?
Yeah, I'm not messing with metadata like that quite yet, because I want to handle it a little bit differently. I want to have a session concept, so that rather than storing the same stuff on every single message, I'm basically saying, this message is associated with session number 5, which is IP address, geolocation, whatever. I store that once and then I associate it with everything in the session, if that makes sense.
Okay, so that was going to be my next question, was because that would be storing too much with IP address, and then you're saying other session data like what browser type they're hitting you with, and all the standard rigmarole.
I'm not saying that we're storing everything that's in the session necessarily, but I'm saying what we are storing about the user session is not going to be in the message. It's going to be a separate table that's linked to Dewdrop activity log.
Right. That was my point. Is if we wanted to add, we're looking for weirdness of, Firefox is something that's weird with Firefox. We can look at the activity log for if we wanted to add that metadata coming out of the session would be stored in that and not in the actual message of the activity log message. Right. So.
Yep.
Okay.
So yeah, I definitely want to add more fields, but I've just been focusing on the core stuff so far.
Yeah, I think my point was the IP address is kind of core, kind of what we need, especially for that anonymous stuff, because that obviously we could point back to something. The geo lookups, that's a different story, and then the session variable, I thought would be kind of a version 2 thing, but I mean, it's good you're thinking about it now. It makes sense.
And to be clear, on the Pronospot stuff, it's never actually going to be anonymous. We're going to have an access key in place, and that access key is tied to a specific email address.
That's correct, but we also want to know the IP address that they're coming from, because those people are going to forward those email addresses around.
Okay.
And so it's like, oh, hey, I'm on vacation, but I got that email. I forwarded it over to Lindsay. Lindsay downloaded from where? Was she at the office? Was she at home? So again, it's anything we can do to help them track down where these files were pulled and all that. I love that it's per email. That makes total sense. Well, that was obviously Lindsay's email. But very, very easy to track to blame. It's not just blanketed completely anonymously. I would completely agree. But my point was that there was no user, and everything I saw in the previous stuff had a user ID and user information. There was nothing anonymous about that, because I wouldn't want, because KOMU's TV station, they don't have a user for the system. They just have that. I emailed it to Lindsay at KOMU.com, and she doesn't have a user on her system, so I didn't know how that would log into it. So that makes sense?
Yep.
But your anonymous message makes sense. I didn't catch that before.
That's something I was thinking about. Wondering about how you might associate different categories or different types of messages. Like, with PSR3 and syslog, we have different log levels, like 8 different levels. And I know that's not really appropriate here since we're not talking about system logs exactly, but I wonder, what would be involved in maybe tagging or categorizing messages, how we might filter them for different audiences, people in the back end, people on the front end, and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, this is really intended for the specific audience of, typically an admin user, but it could be a front-end user in certain circumstances. It's
like if a user
definitely
wanted
not
to watch an entity or something like that.
Yeah, if you wanted to do that, that's kind of the subscription feature I was talking about before. So my idea is essentially you would be going through a form where you say, notify me whenever this list of entities is involved in a log message. And that's how you would pull those out. So it could be a category of entities. So I want to know about insertion order stuff in general. Or it could be I want to know about insertion order stuff involving Kate. So it's got that insertion order tag of some kind and user tag with ID of 8 for Caitlin or whoever. And that would be how you would kind of grab that stream of messages. So it's not something that's put into the data itself, but we're letting them kind of leverage that entity cross-reference table to find stuff on their own, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so.
Cool. As you can probably tell from the very descriptive to-do that I had for actually reading the stuff out, let me pull that back up here. The main activity log class, the idea when you're getting a set of entries is it's going to be kind of similar to the get post methods in WordPress, where you're not writing SQL directly, you're kind of giving a set of options and then you're getting some entries back. So while right now I'm definitely just doing this in the database, I think it could be stored elsewhere at some point. I'm trying to make it storage agnostic. And getting data out of it should be something that's relatively easy to do, even if you're just trying to like sprinkle this stuff around on the different pages in your app. You don't have to understand the schema and things like that to pull it off. It'll just be a little set of options for like how many entries, what types of entries, and like any entities that you're matching. And then there will be a set of view helpers that are built in to kind of do, if you just want to do a simple little stream UI like this, like just give me 5 in a table or something like that, and going to kind of build those into Dewdrop core so that you can easily sprinkle those throughout the app. Cool. Well, if there's no other questions, that's pretty much all I had. But this should go into Dewdrop master not too long in the future. We need to tidy up a little bit more in ProntoSpot. Once it's in there, a lot of this is just going to start happening automatically for anything using later versions of Dewdrop. So, like do-gooder, process to basics, a lot of stuff should just get this automatically grouped in. So it might be a feature worth pointing out to your client. If you click around and play with it a little bit and it seems to be doing something reasonable, might be a good way to like put it in front of them, say, hey, we think this is kind of a cool feature. If you want us to expand it for your project, let us know and we can estimate adding some more messages here and there, that kind of thing.
Looks great, Brad.
Cool. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, Brad.